My guest today spent 4 years as a trustee for the Waterloo Region District School Board from 2014 to 2018. During his first and only term as a trustee, he was elected a board chair in 2016 and 2017. Following his term as a trustee, he ran to be a Woolwich Township councillor for Ward 1. The good folks of Elmira liked what they saw and heard and elected him as one of their two councillors in 2018. He served as township councillor from 2018 to 2022 before stepping down. I'm pleased to welcome to the Old Grey Mares podcast, Scott McMillan. Scott, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. I've been looking forward to this, so I appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, having been myself a former mayor of North Dumfries, so a township politician, I like the opportunity to interview councillors from the other townships. I always feel, we have we have similar experiences, but as a township representative, you bring a different perspective to local politics from the city. And I always say it really puts local into local politics because you always have seems to be a greater opportunity to bump into people at the grocery store or the gas station or back in the day, the transfer station to talk about various issues. You find during your time, there was a lot of that interaction?
Yeah, a lot. For me, luckily for me, I wasn't on council when our transfer station was closed down. I got to avoid that landmine. But for me, it was the arena. So I've always been involved in sports and minor sports and junior hockey. And so a lot of my friends are at the age where their kids are playing hockey and going through the arena. And that was during COVID too. So, why do we have to have these stupid COVID measures? And why can't we open up all the arenas? And why can't we use the dressing room showers and all that kind of stuff? It was, definitely at the arena was a big one. Grocery store, I found people were pretty respectful. I didn't get stopped at the grocery store too much, but definitely at the arena was a time when people felt it was good to let me know everything I was doing wrong.
Well, it's funny you bring up, and that's back in the day, the transfer station was always like that. Bump into someone and end up you're in a 5-10 minute conversation holding up the line or something. But nothing like arena politics in the townships. I mean, everything focuses and centers, it seems, around the arena. I just can't believe it. North Dumfries is a big hockey town. My entry into politics was all around the community center and ice hockey. And you see that Woolwich, Woolwich. Well, you had the Snyder Arena and all that came with that. In Wellesley, they had recently issues with their facility and maybe potentially not enough facilities if they had to shut down a rink. And similarly in Wilmot, I mean, whether they go to 3 rinks or 4 rinks, and then they got a local hockey team, a junior C team that wants more seating, and that creates a whole nother set of issues. It seems it really dominates a lot out there. So anyone who wants to be a township politician better be mindful of maybe rink politics or sports politics that goes on in the small town.
It's similar issues in like all of those communities. There's a big groundswell of support for a larger facility than what the planning criteria might suggest. And I think you got a really fantastic facility built there in North Dumfries. Being with the Sugar Kings the last few years, we got to play the Centennials a bunch, and and the Woolwich Community Center here, and now Wellesley going through that as well. There seems to be a lot of support for more facilities, despite that push to have lower taxes and not investment in.
Well, that's the hard part right now. Is the construction costs and everything else with inflation really inflating considerably the cost to even add a second pad onto a facility is causing a lot of councillors to have pause because you go through your day to day. Now you're suddenly elected, and now you want to be mindful of the pennies. I always joke, it's like you're elected a councillor, you never want to borrow anything. Even though you have a house with a mortgage, you might have a car with a car loan, so you borrow all the time on stuff. But suddenly when you become a councillor, it's like, I can't borrow money. It's not the thing to do. But then you're not going to raise and save enough money to pay cash for it. So
no, and I think it's a bit of common misconception that exists in our personal life as well. Like there's a difference between, you mentioned a mortgage, there's a difference between a loan on an appreciating asset like a house,
right,
as opposed to taking out a loan to buy dinner, or, the municipal equivalent of that would be, to maintain your roads or maintain infrastructure. If you're taking out loans for operating costs, that's different than taking out a loan for capital expenditures that you're going to have for years to come.
Yeah, and with a rink, it would be a capital expenditure because you're building a building, right? The other side of it, though, is if you build that building, and I think I picked that up now that you mention it from Woolwich Council discussions in the past, was, okay, we can build that facility, but what's the cost to operate it?
Yeah,
and sometimes that doesn't get thought about, is the cost to operate it. Because I know Woolwich went through some growing pains with the Snyder facility originally in terms of the heating, cooling costs, or whatever, gas, or whatever the costs were. There was some exorbitant, extremely high costs from the operations of that facility that you all had to wrestle with quite a bit out there.
Yeah, there was the cooling plant in the arena. It was a really, sold as an advanced plant that was going to make, it might have solved the Middle East peace crisis, but it was really sold as this phenomenal thing. And it's been a lot of trouble, like for the amount of repair costs that go into a relatively new building. Yeah. And I think your point is valid that we build these things without the idea of how we're going to maintain it. And I think, suburbs in general are like low density sprawling suburbs. Okay, you can build them, but how are you going to maintain them? But I think with the sake of, or in the case of the Woolwich Memorial Center, I think it was even above and beyond that, where it was like, we just got a lemon. We were just one of the unfortunate, we're in the unfortunate situation of just getting a lemon. So that really impacted things as well.
So you've got your operating costs, and then you've got also, future replacement capital, which no one ever saves for, as they should. But anyway, before we get too deep into the Woolwich stuff, I want to step back though and talk about school board. For you, what was it that got Scott McMillan to decide that he wanted to be a school board trustee?
I had some people around me suggest it. I didn't really know too much about the position, even that it existed. But around 2012, I started to get more actively engaged in politics. I'd spent some time in Finland and in northern Manitoba and in northern Ontario, and kind of seeing different political climates. And I wanted to get more engaged in politics. And I had, in that process of doing that, I had the opportunity to work on Margaret Johnston's provincial campaign in 2014. And Margaret at the time was, she was the trustee, or she was the public school trustee for Kitchener, one of them. So in working with her on her campaign, started to learn more about the role, and she kind of suggested that it might be a good place for me to start. And then I talked to some other people that were elected officials in different roles who had talked to me about, they got their start in politics as a school trustee. So I was kind of thinking about it then. And then our trustee at that time was Harold Paisley from Elmira. And I think Mr. Paisley served 2 terms as trustee, and then he was not going to run again. So there was a vacant seat for trustee in Woolwich and Wellesley, and it was in 2014, so right around the same time that all those conversations were happening, seat opened up, and so I decided to run for it. It was more about wanting to get. Yeah, sorry. Yeah,
so just before we get into that, what community involvement were you doing in the years prior, the few years prior, besides the Johnson campaign you were mentioning?
So like political engagement, like I working on Margaret's campaign, 2012, prior to that, on election day in November in the US, I drove down to Toledo to knock on doors for the US election. So I was part of the Get Out the Vote effort in Toledo for President Obama's re-election campaign. So that was just one day, but it was a pretty fun experience, and kind of my first entrance into that kind of doorstep politics stuff.
So what? But you've been living in Elmira for a while, or?
Yeah, so I came back to Elmira in 2012.
Okay.
So yeah, I left Elmira not Elmira. I lived in Heidelberg, which is it splits Woolwich and Wellesley Township, if you want to talk about fun municipal stuff. But I lived on the Wellesley Township side of Heidelberg, moved away from there in 2005, and then came back in 2012. This was always my home. I came back in the summertime, but.
So what were you doing? What was prior to 2012? What were you doing? You were traveling around for what?
Yeah, I was a hockey coach. So wow. I was in northern Manitoba working for a First Nations reserve coach in their hockey team in the Manitoba Junior Hockey League. Prior to that, I was with the Sioux Greyhounds in the OHL. And then prior to that, I was in Finland. I got a degree from the National Sports University in Finland. And I was working for a couple different teams there for the 2 years that I was going to school there. So yeah, that was 2005.
And were you involved with the Sugar Kings then, the Elmira Sugar Kings back home?
No. I went. I spent a year as an assistant coach with the Wellesley Applejacks. I did some work with Woolwich Minor Hockey, and then I went to Finland.
How is it then that you ended up running for trustee?
Yeah, so like going to Finland, and I was always interested in politics, geopolitical, socioeconomic affairs, that kind of stuff. Going to Finland was a real eye-opening experience for me. Seeing that, there is a different way of doing things than just the way Canadians and Americans do things. So after being in Finland, I came home and kind of really felt like I needed to do something to try to help, improve things here. So in 2012, I came back from Manitoba. And I was working with the Laurier men's hockey team at that time and just had some extra time. So that's when went to Toledo, did that whole thing, started to try to get engaged. And then 2014 was the provincial election. And I just went, I didn't know who Margaret Johnston was.
Right.
I looked, and this was after, Catherine Fife had won her seat in the by-election in 2012.
Gotcha.
Yeah. In the provincial by-election. So I thought Margaret was somebody that, it was worth some time putting some energy into her campaign. Just knocked on the campaign office door and said, "Hey, can I help?" And ended up spending, full-time hours there for the next month on her campaign. And then Margaret and then some family members that I have who have gone through different political arenas. It was kind of the work of them to suggest, "Hey, trustee." My wife has, an aunt that was a trustee at one time, and so they kind of said, "Hey, this might be a role that you'd be interested in."
All right. So just quick, who was your coach? Who was the coach at Laurier when you were there?
Greg Puhalski,
the chief.
Yeah, the chief. He was.
Yeah. So I played at Laurier from 81 to 83.
Oh wow.
Yeah, way back when.
Was that right before him?
He came after. He played after I was there. Yeah. So
neat. Yeah, he's
okay.
We could have a whole hour podcast on Greg Puhalski, I'm sure.
Oh, I know. We won't get into that whole story, but not pleased how that's turned out. But anyway, so now you're elected as a school board trustee. Like when you're running in your campaign, did you have sort of like some priorities or things that you thought you wanted to focus on if you were elected? Like, what was your platform like?
Yeah. I mean, the things that drive me in politics at any level, in any role, are going to be trying to create more equitable opportunities for everybody. I think the thing that drove me in Finland was the much more equitable distribution of wealth. So for me, it's that what got me in was trying to address wealth inequality, which I think is a significant negative impact on our society and on our country. So I thought, and I still think, I believe that education can be a big tool in the solution for wealth inequality.
Right.
So that's what was driving me. I wasn't aware as a trustee, running for trustee, I wasn't aware of how that would manifest itself. But that's what was driving me is, how can we remove systemic barriers to success that different people face? How that was going to play out, I might have had some ideas, but I didn't know what school board meetings looked like. I didn't know what any meetings looked like. I'd only seen like question period from Queen's Park or Parliament Hill. So, that's what I thought politics was.
Did you observe any meetings while you were thinking about running or while you were running or?
I went to a school board meeting after I won, but I didn't before. I had a little bit of insight of what it was like from Margaret, but it wasn't until after I won that I thought, well, what do we do now? And decided to go to a couple meetings.
Okay. Well, let me ask you just a quick question and we can get into more depth if there is, but you wanted to find some ways to deal with economic inequality. Yeah. Did you find any opportunities as a trustee?
The one area that I would say that we had an opportunity to address it was French immersion. French immersion, for all of the things that it can be good for, has in places become an opportunity to tier our education system. So kids who have a lot of support, have access to, parental help or additional resources, can thrive in French immersion, where maybe kids who don't come from that environment don't. And I think you can look at French immersion classes at, kindergarten, and maybe they're split 50-50 between French immersion and the mainstream. And maybe by grade 8, like the class sizes are, 28 in the mainstream and 15 in the French immersion, because kids just kind of slide out of the program. Right. So you end up with the kids who are furthest ahead to start are now getting a more a better education experience. So let me just ask Scott. So you're seeing French immersion as a way to do that, and did your term, the board during your term, take any steps in that direction? We had a committee to review French immersion, but in the end, we didn't address it. So no, that was the one thing, and we tried. There were a few of us that were pretty engaged on trying to address that inequality. It didn't work, but that was a big one. And then, so let me just drill on that for a second. So here you are, you have an opportunity to try to do something, but you're one person, one view, and you're working with others. So you're working with other counselors and I guess staff on this potential to change. What was it you were hoping that you would be able to do, but weren't able to do? I think that there are opportunities to make French immersion more equitable. I know that in I think it's the York School Board, one of my cousin's kids went to French immersion and they had a lottery for it. So like kids it was a different selection process. Oh, yeah. Whether it was operated out of one central school, like French immersion, oftentimes there's not busing to French. Well, there is not busing to French immersion. So if you want to go to French immersion, there's not one offered in your school area. You've got to get to French immersion. And so that kind of thing, could make it, if there was busing for French immersion, that would make it easier for parents who don't have a car for their kids to go to French immersion, So you were trying to do something to make French immersion more available in a broader context around the region within the district of the school board? Yeah, more equitable on the intake. And then I think also French immersion, when you're in French immersion, oftentimes kids that maybe school isn't easy for them. If they're in French immersion, one of our first reactions is get them out of French immersion, get them into just the English program, core French. So the kids who struggle in school all end up getting out of French immersion, which creates, an upper tier classroom because it's self-selecting for all of the kids who can just function at a high level in that classroom.
Right,
so
right.
Like a more equitable input on the intake, and then also working to maintain that equity as you go through. I think the other thing that was driving me in my time, and I again, you've been on municipal politics, results are slow. But
right.
The one thing that I saw that I was hoping to work towards in Waterloo region was the Toronto District School Board had a focused program on trying to increase the graduation rates of Black boys. And in doing that, in addressing the graduation rates for Black boys, they increased the graduation rates across the board. And I think that that's something that our school board has become a lot more engaged in since I've left. And so if you ask, what did you accomplish? There's not a lot of, past motions or policy items that we can point to. There were a couple, but there are things that got implemented in the term that followed me, and the term that followed that one that we started laying the brickwork for back in 2014, 2016. And it's just now getting, so the pride flag was raised at all of our schools when I was the chair. Saying our schools are a welcoming place to everybody. That was a big one. The conversation, it didn't get implemented, and the staff that did the work and the trustees that were on the school board at the time deserve a ton of credit for it. They deserve all the credit for it. But the conversation started when we were there around free menstrual products for girls, because there's like 1/3 of girls don't go to school when they have their period because they can't afford menstrual products. Like that type of equity. We've got people staying home, like that kind of thing. That was another one. So the de-streaming now in grade 9 is another one. So these are things that have happened that I feel like, hey, that's the direction that I was trying to push us. And we didn't get the job done.
And that raises a good point. I think a lot of people don't sometimes think of it this way. Councillors are elected for a term every 4 years, but things don't always happen in nice little 4-year increments, and it takes, so it's almost like you start something, but you're going to have to be prepared to recognize that you could very well be gone before the thing is finished. You're just basically passing the baton on to the next group for them to continue on the work that you laid the groundwork for. And it shouldn't be looked at as a failure that you didn't get done in the 4 years, because it takes time. And so that presumably is why staff is there, because they provide that continuity through all of that when counselors come and go. But staff, for the most part, a lot of them are, 20-year, 25-year type employees who can provide that continuity.
But I think it speaks to a larger point, and you've served on a few councils, enough councils to know we've both served with, I'm sure, people that find serving as a councillor or a trustee very rewarding, and there are other people that find it extremely frustrating. And I think one of the big differences between the two is how concerned they are with who gets credit for what gets done.
Right.
And I think even in the things that happen quickly, a lot of times, if you're a township councillor, the quickest way to get something done is to go to the appropriate staff member, say, here's my concern. Is there something we can do about this? And a lot of times the staff can say, absolutely, that is within the already existing bylaw, and we can make this change, and we can get that done. Now, you don't get to, bring a motion to council. You don't get to have a vote. It's not going to be written about in the paper, but it got done. And the constituent you're working on behalf of, they know it got done. But if you're worried about getting credit for it, oftentimes you bring a motion. Now it's a political issue. now, it brings all kinds of other stuff in, and now you don't get your thing done. And you're frustrated and saying, well, nothing ever happens because all these other counselors are idiots. But it really, it's, if you're not worried about who gets credit for the success, you can get a lot more done, even in your term, but especially getting things, getting the ball rolling on some things.
It's about that team approach. But let me ask you this, because you and I were talking earlier before we did the show, and you were telling me about that piece of advice you got when you first became a trustee. And why don't you tell us again what that was?
Yeah, I was really, really fortunate to have Ted Martin as a mentor on the school board, and Ted's a brilliant guy. Served a long time as a trustee, and he kind of took me under his wing a little bit. And the first piece of advice that he gave me is, you're not the official opposition. I talked earlier about question period at Queen's Park and Parliament Hill, and that's largely theatrics. There's not a lot of, there is no work getting done during question period. It's just theatrics. But for a lot of people in municipal politics, they see themselves as the official opposition to the bureaucrat staff who they think is the government.
So just to clarify, you're not, like, you were the new trustee, but that wasn't meant to be in relation to, like, let's say, an older existing long-term trustee. That was more in relation to you as the elected trustee and questioning staff or dealing with staff. You shouldn't have that opposition, us to them mentality.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I probably should have started there. Like, as a trustee or a councillor, a lot of our meetings are receiving reports from staff. And staff get up in the meeting and they deliver a report. And I mean, they put so many hours and weeks and months of effort into these reports. Yeah. And there are some elected officials who see their role as, trying to dissect the report and find the mistakes and make sure staff, are made aware of the mistakes that they made, and make sure that the public knows that I'm finding these mistakes. And they become that official opposition in the council meeting or in the school board.
Right. And so rather than, because you get these reports ahead of time to review, and there is opportunity for the most part to email or contact a staff person directly before a meeting to get some clarification on an issue. But some people will use the public meeting as an opportunity to, would you say, grandstand?
I'm glad you said it. Yes, absolutely.
No, I asked the question. You're giving me the
answer. That's exactly. I think I used the term political theater. But yeah, it's grandstanding. And I think that. Let me back up a little bit. I think for some people it's grandstanding. I think for other people, they are genuinely believing that's what their role is. And they feel like this is what they're supposed to do, and this is the best thing they can do for their constituents. There are those people. And then there are others who are just absolutely grandstanding. And I think a lot of times, most times with the reports, your question of clarification, or like if you're reading a report and you say, this just absolutely doesn't make sense. Like, did staff even think about this thing over here that, I think would be a better idea? A quick email, I think we usually got our agenda packages about, in midweek when the meeting was next week. Yeah. Just a quick email to the staff person that wrote the report to say, did you think about this? And they can often say something like, we used to do it that way, and then the province, passed this bill that doesn't allow that to happen anymore. Right. That's why we have to do it this way. And we wish we could still do it that way, but we're locked into this way by provincial legislation.
Right. And there you go. You got your answer. It reminds me, I did a great podcast with Mike Murray where we talked about the staff politician dynamic. We spent the whole hour just talking about it. Yeah. And I think there has to be recognition that you have a working relationship with each other. Each brings to it an important perspective. You as the elected politician bring the perspective of the community to the table, but the staff bring we hope always the professionalism, the background, and everything else to provide us with the data we need in order to make those decisions, or help us get the information we need to make those decisions on behalf of the community. And that's working together.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you talked before about how, my term on the school board was 4 years. My term on council was 4 years. Like most of the staff that I served with on council are still there now. A lot of people that were on the school board staff when I was there are still there. Right. One of the issues that I talked to you about that got, moved along, 3 years after I left the school board, it was a staff person. It was the continuity among staff that kept that issue going so that the trustees could vote on it 3 years later. It was that continuity. And if you have an antagonistic approach to your relationship with the staff, like you're not going to get nearly as much done as you could. If you have a positive working relationship, when you go to a staff person and say, this is my problem, what can we do? That person is going to want to help you. They want to do good work. If your goal is to embarrass staff and make them look bad, then you're going to have walls put up when you try to go.
Then they're always going to be cautious. Yeah. So let's segue on this theme of antagonistic. And so we want to work well with staff, but also too, when you're elected, you're your own individual, but you're part of a group of elected people, and you need to get consensus, at least a majority amongst your group, in order to move the agenda forward. And I think you ran into some issues with respect to that as well, in terms of this cohesiveness around the horseshoe or whatever, the table.
Yeah. And I think, you talk about people who are frustrated as elected officials and, nothing good ever gets done. Nothing good ever happens. Your one vote is useless. Like as one person, you're useless. Like if you don't have the ability to connect with people, exchange ideas, collaborate, get people on board. If you don't have that ability, you're not going to get anything done. On the school board, we had 11 people. The chair didn't vote, 10 votes. Like if you can't get 6 people, if you can't get 6 votes, so 5 people to agree with you, you can't get anything done. It doesn't matter how smart you are. You can be the smartest person in the world. Nothing's happening. And at the end of the day, like anything else, politics is personal. It is personal. And if you have a good working relationship with the other people sitting around the horseshoe, you're going to have an ability to go to them and get some help when you need it. And I think, I really valued that on my time on Woolwich Council. It was Larry Shantz in Breslau, in Ward 3 that, oftentimes Larry would give me a call and say, hey, this is what I'm trying to do. What do you think? Like, what do I need to do with this so that I can have your support?
But let's talk about that. But I want to talk about your trustee time, though. What was that like? Were you having those sorts of conversations with people?
Yeah, absolutely. So like Ted was somebody that I still consider a mentor. So anytime I wanted to do something, Ted was my first call. Like, and he had the added benefit of having been there a long time. So, he could say, well, we tried this 7 years ago and this is what failed. But Ted was a phone call. And then, there were other trustees that I had, great working relationships with. That I would always contact before to say, hey, what are we thinking here? What direction do I need to think about going?
But the board had a few code of conduct issues and investigations.
Yeah, sure did.
And that's between councillors or trustees, I mean, right?
Yeah, it was definitely, when I started on the school board, I was one of 3 new trustees. Right. So there were 8 existing trustees, and some of them had been there. Yeah, some of them had been there, for a long time. And I think anytime you have a group of people that are in that type of environment, especially where it's like if I build a team, if I have you own your law practice, you can hire people in the hiring process.
Oh, yeah.
You can look
Thank
for,
God.
things. Yeah. You can look for people that can fit. You can rearrange people that maybe there's a little bit of rub here. I can reassign you and that kind of thing. Nobody's doing that for elected officials.
Well, there's a saying. I heard from somebody the other day. Like, there's that saying: you can pick your friends, but not your family. But then you can say you can pick your friends, but not your fellow councillors.
Yes, exactly. So, like, when you're on that board for a long time and you don't get to pick who you're working with, and it's not the mountain that makes the trip impossible; it's the stone in your shoe, and it's just that little irritant. But over 20 years, it starts to drive you crazy. We had some of that on the school board. There was some personality.
I think I read, was there like an anonymous survey that said that the trustees were working poorly together or something like that during that time?
Yeah. So we did at the end of every year, we did a performance appraisal of the board, of ourselves.
Oh, okay.
And so, there were, I think, like 6 out of 11 people that said we were working poorly, but, that was what I walked into as the chair. Like, I started as the chair in September, and
we'll get to that in a sec. But was that survey done before you became chair?
Yes. You know what? Sorry, I became chair. That happens in the meeting in December.
Right. So let me just ask you this. So this is a bit new to me when I was reading this. So every year you would elect a chair?
Yes.
Okay. And generally the person who was the chair the year before would get reelected generally, probably.
You could only serve 2 terms, 2 years.
Oh, okay.
So we had term limits. Yeah, term limits for chair. We got trustees that served 50 years, but we got term limits for chair.
Okay, so if you had term limits for chair, does that mean you could never serve again if you were 2 years?
No, you could go back. So if you serve, you just couldn't serve a third consecutive term.
So tell me this. You got 8 veterans and 3 rookies.
Yeah.
Somebody's chair for 2 years, and then this board turns to a rookie to take over as chair in the second half of that term.
Yeah. So we had gotten to the point, the board had been pretty right-leaning for a while.
Like politics, you mean, in the politics?
Yeah, left-wing, right-wing. It had been pretty right-leaning for a while. Maybe it had gone a little bit left, like just prior to me being there. So prior to my term on council, Ted Martin, who is, left-leaning, he was the chair. But prior to that, it had been like a few years of people like Mike Ramsey, John Hendry, our Kitchener-Conestoga MP, Harold Albrecht, had been a chair back in. Like, it had been a long string. Elizabeth Whitmer had been the chair. Like, it was a long string of conservative, right-leaning. Not hard right, but right of center.
Yeah, I understand.
So just prior to me coming in, it had kind of shifted like a 6-5 split, left to right. So Ted had been the chair as a left-leaning person. And then my first 2 years as a trustee, Kathleen Woodcock, who would call herself left of center. She's progressive on most issues. She was the chair. And we had, about 6 votes in this, on the left side of things.
Right.
So we had enough to kind of ram through a chair, and Ted Martin was going to run for chair again. Yes. But Ted was involved in one of the code of conduct complaints. And he was in the middle of a pretty significant conflict with another trustee at that time. Okay. And he said, it's not going to be productive for me to be the chair again. Like this, it's just going to be about me and this other trustee. So, he and I talked and thought, it might be a good idea if one of the new people became chair, one of the 3 new trustees that didn't have any of this decades long history, because all the other trustees had been there like many, many terms. It was myself and 2 other new trustees, and they didn't want to do it. Like it was a hot
So you were the consensus candidate.
Well, no, because the 5 right-leaning people, we don't want this yet.
So was it a 6-5 vote?
I don't think it was 6-5. I honestly can't remember. I'm not even sure who else ran. I can't remember. Like you had a pretty good idea what the result was going to be before we started. So I can't even remember who else ran.
So Scott, I'm just going to read you a quote that I took from one of the newspaper articles after you got elected. It says, trustees took a tentative step toward better relations in December by choosing McMillan as chair. The rookie trustee is a former junior hockey coach who hopes to use his coaching skills to help trustees work as a team.
Yeah, I mean, there was a little bit of what would you call it? Journalistic liberties taken with that quote. Like, I didn't have that hope that, hey, I'm a hockey coach, I can make this all work.
No,
like,
I understand.
I did have some I think there are some similarities. Like when you're leading a group, when you're leading any group, like your team at your law office, there's going to be conflict. How do you manage that conflict? Like that's a big part of your job. It's not just.
No, I understand, but did you use that as part of your campaign pitch?
That was not me. I never would have drawn that connection, and I have been mocked mercilessly for it for years.
Did you bring a whistle? Did you bring a whistle to the meetings? And establish a penalty box?
Yes. Yeah. No, I didn't do that. And I think I might have sprained an eyeball rolling my eyes when I first read that line in that article. But
let's move on. I just want to ask you this then. Now you're a chair, right? And
yeah,
being a chair of a meeting is a pretty substantial position. You may be called. First of all, you got to know Robert's rules or the code of, or your policies and procedures bylaw that you're going to have. You got to understand somebody might challenge the chair or want a point of clarification. You got to make sure that motions are seconded. Is something a friendly amendment or not a friendly amendment, and all those sorts of things. And people declaring conflicts of interest, although that's of their own accord to make sure they do that. It's not your responsibility to know if somebody has a conflict or not. But the other thing that came up, and we all saw this when Scott Piatowski was chair, and there was a delegation that was presenting to the school board, and I won't mention the delegation name, but was presenting, and Scott had to make a decision at that particular point about whether to allow the delegation to continue or not continue. And Scott's concern was whether or not the delegation's comments were going to violate I think it was the Ontario Human Rights Code or something like that.
Not violate. I remember I was watching that pretty closely. Not violate, but be in contrast to it.
Contravention of.
Yeah.
Okay.
So not a violation, but just speaking in a way that.
If it's in contravention, anyway, we won't quibble over. We got the right idea. And then you also had your own experience when you were on Woolwich Council of a councillor making comments during the discussion of the crosswalk, and then there was a question about whether or not the chair. The mayor at the time should have intervened or intervened in time or not in time and all that sort of thing. And I think I just wanted to touch on the difficulty of being a chair and trying to deal with all these things that are happening and being able to make decisions in as timely a manner as possible without sort of being second guessed by armchair quarterbacks.
Yeah, it's really, really tough. And in watching both of those meetings, I'm really, really confident that both of the people chairing the meeting had the best intentions. It manifested itself differently. They were both, ridiculed terribly for a decision that you can't be prepared for. It's nothing you can prepare for.
Well, also just hold on. It's funny because they each made different decisions.
Yes.
One cut off a person and the other one allowed a person to speak. So that's also an interesting thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in Scott's case, his feeling was we have to err on the side of protecting marginalized kids. And I'm not sure if this is right, but that if I'm going to make an error, I'm going to err on the side of protecting marginalized kids. And I think in Mayor Shantz's case, in the meeting for Woolwich Council, I think Sandy seeks the good in everybody. And I think in that meeting, you saw her trying to dig into the councillor to say, is this what you mean? Is this what you mean? Like trying to say like, we hear what you're saying, but is it this that you mean? Trying to find the good in every single person. And I think both of them, if knowing what they know now, looking back on it, would probably say, you know what, maybe it could have worked out better if I had done differently. But it's not a situation. We talked about like reports from staff that we got a week in advance. Like you don't get a week in advance when somebody just speaks off the cuff. And
it's split second.
Yes. And it is until you sit in that seat, it is really, really difficult to understand, you know, like sometimes you're looking at the meeting agenda and you're talking to the clerk or the parliamentarian to say, you know, what is, you know, where does this fit into the agenda? Somebody's putting a motion. Should this be deferred into this part? And while you were talking about the agenda and thinking about the whole meeting, something can get said that you don't like, you hear it, but it's not registering at the time. Like that can happen. And I think that until you sit in a seat and try to keep all those balls in the air, you don't know how difficult it is.
I remember being on calling in Farwell when he was commenting on the Scott Piatowski, so Mike Farwell's show. And I was pointing that exact thing out. I said, look, until you're actually in that chair having to make that sort of decision, this is not something you're trained for. You know, you're suddenly chair. Now you've got the gavel and you're at the head of the table and dealing with speakers and everything else. And, you know, just making sure you understand Robert's rules and anything else. And then now you have to monitor speech and potential hate speech or other types of speech. And it is, in this climate that we're in, probably one of the most difficult positions to be in. Right. To deal
and I
with
think
all
it's
that.
important. It's important to know. And this is where I think like people who are reporting on these stories, who are magnifying the message of these stories, I think it's important for them to dig beyond the surface, because a lot of this was made out to be Scott Piatowski and a lot of it was made out to be Mayor Sandy Shantz. But in Scott's case, there was a challenge to the ruling of the chair. Any ruling of the chair in a meeting can be challenged.
Sure.
You have to have a motion to challenge the chair. That has to be seconded. There's a vote on the ruling of the chair. That night, there was a vote on the ruling of the chair, and it was upheld. So
he was supported. Let me ask you this. So you weren't on the school board when that happened.
No.
But you were on council when Sandy was going through that whole situation. Yes. What were your thoughts?
Well, that's like, my thoughts were, I should have called a point of order.
Right.
I dropped the ball. And part of that was, you know, I'm working in an environment where I'm coming out of being a chair for the school board. I had a way of chairing meetings. It was different than the way Sandy chaired meetings. The school board, the way their meetings operate, is different than council.
Right.
Much more formal at the school board, informal at council. So I don't want to try to chair the meeting from the horseshoe. That's Sandy's job.
Right.
But at the same time, just like Scott's ruling was challenged and it was upheld, in Sandy's case, there are 5 people in the meeting that can stop those comments at any time. It's not just the chair. And that was my view at the time, was that any of the councillors could have called a point of order to address the issue of what they were hearing at that time. Absolutely. And it speaks to what you're talking about, like not being prepared and it happening fast. That topic was not on the agenda. There was a correspondence, this is getting into the weeds, but there was correspondence from a municipality about a Pride Rainbow crosswalk. Somebody had pulled the correspondence out of that section of the agenda and asked if we could talk about it. So then we started talking about the Pride flag crosswalk. And so if we had known this was going to be on the agenda, maybe we're all just a little bit more alert, a little bit more ready for those types of comments. but it wasn't on the agenda. It was at
So
the end
just
of
to
the
explain for
meeting.
anyone, so just to explain for anyone listening, when you get your agenda package, you'll have reports on different issues that you're working on for the township, and at the end there'll be a compilation of a section that has all the correspondence that the township will receive from different ministers, ministries, other townships, etc. And it's just usually a general catch-all. So what you're saying is at that meeting, then at your actual council meeting, someone and usually you don't even talk about the correspondence. You just receive it. It's a motion to receive, and that's it. You've read it on your own. But someone actually at the meeting asked to have that pulled, and then you started a conversation on this issue during that meeting. That's really the first time you would have known that somebody wanted to have a conversation about this.
Right. I thought it was just going to be hey, we received the letter, and they were asking, the correspondence was asking other municipalities to explore the opportunity for a flag crosswalk. I thought it was just going to be, rubber stamp. Absolutely.
Hey, staff to take a look and come back with a report.
Yeah, we're going to get a report in 2 months about this. And it was actually somebody speaking in favor of it that wanted to pull it so that they could make, they could publicly support it so that the public would know that we as council are supporting this.
Right. And then
so the whole meeting is going, it's not even part of the agenda. And then as soon as we're talking about it, it's going in one direction, and then it takes a hard 180 and goes in a different direction. And we're all caught off guard.
It took a hard right turn.
Yes. And we were all caught off guard. And Sandy bore the brunt of that. But I could have called a point of order.
I understand.
At any time.
I understand. So let me ask you, you did your term as your school board trustee, and now you run for Woolwich Council. What was going through your decision-making process for that?
I had a job that was making the trustee position really, really difficult. So I wasn't going to run for trustee. And I had talked to Karen Meisner, ended up running after me, succeeding me. I had talked to her. She was on board to do it. And then I got a new job that did allow me to serve again. But Karen had already decided she wanted to run. So I didn't feel like that would be appropriate for me to double back and change my mind there. And then Scott Hahn was the councillor in my ward in Woolwich Council, and he resigned. With about a few months to go in his term, he got a job with family, and he had to resign. So there was a seat open on Woolwich Council. So my job changed, and then that seat opened up. And Karen was going to run for trustee, and I thought, I'll run for council now. It's kind of.
Well, so you would have considered running for trustee again?
Yeah, I was enjoying my time as a trustee, and would have done that as well if professionally I'd been able to make it work. But I was happy to take on a new challenge as well.
So during your term as councillor in Woolwich, was there any particular issue or item that you'd worked on that you were pleased to see how it turned out?
Things that we worked on that I was pleased how they worked out, because there's a bunch of those other ones that we talked about earlier that I was trying to work on that we didn't get much done. But we've got Myra, there's a downtown revitalization. We have a community improvement plan that our BIA worked on with our staff member that works with the BIA. They created that. So there is some revitalization of our downtown core. That was a big one. That was a big thing that I was running on was trying to re-improve the Elmira core.
One thing I read about was a diversity and inclusivity committee and training.
Yeah. So I got a motion passed early in our term. That was like the summer of 2020 when all the Black Lives Matter, George Floyd. So I got a motion early that the region that we were going to request to the region that equity, anti-racism, diversity training be available to all elected officials in Waterloo region. And that passed. I don't know, the region, I don't know what they did with that. And then late after that meeting that we were talking about, we were able to pass a motion that we were going to explore having a diversity committee for Woolwich Council. So that was nice to get that kind of done before our term wrapped up.
Let me ask you: is there a rainbow crosswalk in Elmira?
There is not yet. They're in the process of like determining where it's going to go, and
okay, so it's in process.
Yeah, and I'm not sure where they are in that process. I know like that was right as I was finishing my term. Yeah. It could sound stupid because there might be one, and I haven't driven over it. But I don't think that they've gotten to that point in the process yet. I know they were working on community outreach and connecting with impacted communities and getting that work done. But I think the ball is rolling, but they don't have paint on the ground yet. That's
one of those batons that got handed off to the next term.
Yeah. We were able to get the pride flag raised at township flag poles, and nice. We were at the school board. We did that in 2016, my first year as chair, and I probably got 1,000 emails about how we were ruining Canada, and then we raised it in Woolwich Township, and I didn't get one email. Like it was like we had moved past it in 4 years.
Times they are a-changing, as they say.
Yeah.
So why didn't you run again for re-election?
Work again.
Oh, work related. Okay.
Yeah. I had a different position with my employer, and for compliance reasons, they would have preferred me not serving as an elected official. So
I got you. Okay. So Scott, so let's just wrap this up then, and you tell me about your experience as a trustee and as a councillor overall. Was it a worthwhile experience? You recommend it to others, or you tell others to stay away? What's your view?
I think that it was without a doubt some of the most rewarding work that I did in my life. Like I really enjoyed it. I really, really am glad that I did it. That being said, I think it's also probably the most frustrating work that I did in my life. And I think, would I recommend it? I would recommend it to anybody after they answered me the question, what do you expect to get done in your 4 years? Yeah. Because if your expectation is that you're going to go in 4 years as one person and tear down everything and rebuild it in your image, like, don't bother. You're not going to get anywhere. You're going to hate your life. You're going to hate your job, and you're never going to serve again. But if it's the doing of the work, if it's the building of community, if it's, just service, if it's, you feel a drive to be of service to your community, then I think there's not much that I've found that can be more rewarding than this type of work.
Well, listen, Scott, I just want to say we're going to end it here. And I just want to say thank you for your service. And hopefully, whether through your employer or some other situation, you'll be able to come back and provide service to your community again. So all the best. Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. Really appreciate you having me on. Thank you. Yeah, no, enjoyed it. Thanks, Scott. Thank you for listening to another edition of the Old Grey Mayors podcast. If you have any ideas for stories or people you would like us to interview or reach out to, please feel free to contact us. And thank you again.